Hey there, folks. If you want to stay up to date with the latest stories and analysis, make sure to follow S News. Support us by subscribing, liking and, dropping a comment. It really helps us keep going. What you're seeing right now is the Syrian Army's General Staff building burning. It was hit by Israeli fighter jets. Moments later, missiles struck around the presidential palace. Shortly after, rockets rained down on military units loyal to Syrian President Ahmad al-Shah in the city of Suwayda. Then strikes followed one after another in Daraa. Precise attacks. Why? Because Israel wanted to pressure President al-Shah to pull his forces out of southern Syria, especially from Daraa and Suwayda. Did he comply? Yes. Al-Shah withdrew his troops not only from Daraa and Suwayda, but from the entire southern region of Syria. But he didn't leave empty-handed. Before pulling out, he signed a security agreement with the Druze factions in the south. This agreement set a series of binding conditions both sides had to follow. So, what were those conditions? Was al-Shah's withdrawal voluntary, or was he cornered? And what will happen next in southern Syria now that government forces are gone? Will the region declare independence and split from the state? And perhaps the most urgent question, what exactly is that unknown fate that al-Shah said the area miraculously escaped thanks to American, Arab and Turkish mediation? Let's break it all down. First, a quick reminder, if you don't know who the Druze are, we covered their history and background in an earlier episode called The Druze War. You can go back and watch it for more detailed context. What matters here is that al-Shah negotiated with the Druze religious leaders and reached a security agreement in exchange for military withdrawal. Now, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the conflict between al-Shah's forces and the Druze turned into a massacre. Just yesterday, they reported 374 confirmed deaths, and that number keeps rising as more bodies are found. Some were discovered in mass graves wrapped in plastic and piled inside Suwayda National Hospital. Among the dead were 148 civilians from the Druze family, allegedly killed by government forces. These aren't rumours. These figures come directly from human rights monitors. In Suwayda itself, there were 107 local deaths, including 28 civilians, 4 women and 4 children. Some died in crossfire, but 27 Druze family members were summarily executed, shot on the streets. Another 14 bodies remain unidentified. Meanwhile, the Druze factions retaliated, killing 207 soldiers loyal to al-Shah and 15 others who were victims of Israeli airstrikes. Reportedly, 3 more were killed when Israeli missiles struck the Syrian Ministry of Defense. And all this happened within just 90 hours. Here's the key point. Al-Shah didn't withdraw because of the deaths. He only agreed to pull out after Israel launched direct strikes on high-value targets, the General Staff building in central Damascus and the presidential complex. Only then did he finally agree to withdraw, but strictly under certain negotiated conditions with the Druze. Let's take a closer look at these conditions. First, a comprehensive ceasefire between the Druze factions and government forces. This also included stopping Israeli air raids, which Israel claimed were no longer justified after al-Shah's forces left. But was that really the end of Israeli aggression? Not even close. Israel made it clear it would continue targeting Syrian sites until all its demands were met. This wasn't the first time they bombed the presidential palace, and probably it won't be the last. So why hit the General Staff building and the presidential palace? Strategically, the message was crystal clear. The General Staff is the nerve center for military operations in southern Syria, where attacks are planned and orders given. By hitting it, Israel was telling al-Shah, "You no longer control the south." As for the presidential palace, that's where al-Shah hosted foreign leaders. By striking it, Israel was essentially saying, "You're no longer the legitimate head of state. You no longer receive world leaders. You no longer conduct diplomacy. You're not in charge." The second condition was the creation of a joint monitoring committee made up of Syrian government representatives and Druze leaders. Their job was to oversee the ceasefire and manage security protocols. At first glance, this seems reasonable, but it effectively put the Druze religious authorities on equal footing with the Syrian state, a dangerous slope toward independence. The third condition allowed government police to return to southern towns like Suwayda, but only under the command of Druze officers. In other words, Al-Shah could send his men back, but they answered to local Druze authorities. It was a symbolic concession that further weakened the government's authority in the area. Then Al-Shah responded with a fourth clause calling for the full reintegration of Suwayda into state institutions. The fifth clause reaffirmed national sovereignty. The sixth demanded the restoration of government services under Syrian law and constitutional authority. But the Druze tribe wasn't united. Their leadership was divided. Sheikh Yusuf Jibbar, one of their prominent figures, supported the agreement, if only to stop the bloodshed. But Sheikh Hikmat al-Haidari, considered the spiritual leader of the Druze community, outright rejected any deal and called for continuing the resistance until all of southern Syria was liberated. What exactly he meant by liberation wasn't very clear. Did he want a full military withdrawal of government forces or complete independence? In response to this split among Druze leaders, Al-Shah added a new clause to the agreement: all weapons held by civilians must be regulated. That meant either registering the weapons with the government or handing them over. Did the Druze agree? Not exactly. Instead, they added a clever appendix. Weapons would only be regulated in coordination with the Druze religious and local authorities, considering the unique historical and social context of the area. Translation: they kept their weapons. Al-Shah might have written the agreement, but the Druze added the fine print. The Druze also had their own demands. First, respect for the sanctity of homes and civilian life. No more raids, no more extrajudicial killings under the name of security. They warned that if this happened again, the ceasefire would end. Second, new laws guaranteeing full civil rights for Druze citizens equal to any other Syrian citizen. They pointed to past abuses, including a disturbing incident where a young woman got caught in crossfire and was left to die without help. Third, a truth committee to investigate human rights violations committed by both sides against Druze civilians and government forces alike. Fourth, compensation for victims. If your home was destroyed, your family killed, or your property looted, you deserve to be compensated. Fifth, securing and reopening roads between Suwayda and Damascus. They argued the whole war started when government forces kidnapped a Druze fruit seller on this road. That kidnapping sparked the Druze family's revenge and the cycle of violence that followed. Sixth, providing basic infrastructure, electricity, fuel, water and healthcare. They didn't ask for luxuries, just the right to live with dignity. Seventh, releasing all imprisoned Druze family members and transparency about the whereabouts of missing people. Eighth, and finally creating a monitoring committee to ensure the agreement is enforced. The Druze warned that if the government fails to implement the deal, they would renew their push for autonomy or full independence. So, what happened to the government's plan to unify all militias into one national army? It partially succeeded. Some groups allied with the state joined, but Druze factions in the south and Kurdish forces in the north refused. Why? Because joining meant disarming, and neither side was willing to give up their weapons. This is the crisis Syria faces today. A country divided into armed pockets, each acting independently, all undermining national unity. The risk of civil war remains dangerously high. Meanwhile, President Al-Shah gave a speech to the nation, accusing Israel of trying to dismantle the Syrian state and blaming it for pushing the country toward fragmentation. He said the United States, Turkey and Arab mediators helped him avoid a war that would have destroyed southern Syria. He added that instead of fighting Israel, the government chose to withdraw and negotiate with Druze leaders. The goal, he said, was to preserve southern Syria, even if that meant giving up direct control for now. Al-Shah argued that as long as Druze factions remain part of Syria, the country will stay united. But what about those Israeli airstrikes on military and presidential buildings? Will there be a response? Al-Shah said Syria reserves the right to respond and holds Israel responsible for the attacks. But he didn't give any timeline, strategy or plan. Given the current situation, the facts are hard to ignore. Al-Shah was forced to back down. Israel, has unmatched air superiority over Syrian skies. Syria doesn't have effective air defense, even around its most critical infrastructure. This level of vulnerability is really unprecedented. Imagine, just for a moment, another country bombing the Pentagon or the Turkish presidential palace. That's exactly what just happened in Syria. The bitter irony is this: Israel, which once supported al-Shah's rise by weakening Syrian military capabilities, is now bombing those very institutions. Why? Because al-Shah dared to act independently. He dared to return to southern Syria against Israel's wishes. Even the Israeli Prime Minister admitted this, saying al-Shah violated a previous agreement and must be punished. The Israeli flag now flies over the governor's office in Quneitra, guarded by tanks. In another widely circulated video, Druze civilians in southern Syria wave the Israeli flag. Whether out of fear or frustration, this is a powerful symbolic act, and it really raises the question, what kind of pressure or desperation makes a Syrian citizen raise a foreign flag over their home? Before blaming that person, maybe we should ask what brought them to this point. Was their home raided? Was a loved one killed? Or was their community forcibly displaced? Of course, Druze factions aren't innocent either. They've committed violence as well, but the cycle started with relentless brutality from state forces, disappearances, arrests, checkpoints, and humiliation. Even the Syrian defense minister condemned some of these actions, calling them the work of a deviant minority within the armed forces. So where does Turkey stand in all this? President Erdogan once promised to defend Syria's territorial unity and even offered to supply weapons to help rebuild its defences. Turkish military experts visited 3 Syrian air bases to assess their condition. But just days later, Israel bombed all 3 bases. The message was clear: no one armed Syria without consequences. Since then, Turkey has remained silent. So the final urgent question is, what now? If Israel can bomb Syrian command centers with impunity, what's left to protect? Where is deterrence? Where is resistance? Where is the united front? President al-Shah needs to understand that negotiating without leverage gets you nowhere. If he wants Israel to listen, he has to regain the ability to make them listen, whether by military means, regional alliances, or changing the diplomatic balance. Because right now, the only thing Israel fears is resistance, and if Syria isn't a threat, Israel has no reason to stop. Finally, I just want to thank you all for listening and for sticking with us through this story. If you want to stay updated, don't forget to follow S News and keep an eye out for our future videos. Please subscribe, like and comment. Your support